Monday morning at headquarters always carried a certain hum keyboards rattling, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room, the shuffle of shoes against polished glass floors. We filed into the stand-up, 30 bodies pressed into the conference room with its transparent walls and panoramic view of Boston's skyline. I stood near the whiteboard where my color-coded integration roadmap still clung, a mural I'd been sculpting for months. Trent walked in late, tie crooked, grin sharp. He didn't bother with the usual updates. Instead, he stopped in front of everyone, cleared his throat, and said, "Celeste, I'm going to need your badge. You're redundant." The word landed like a slap. Redundant. As if I were a misprinted page, a spare cog no one needed. My breath stilled. And then I noticed the screen behind him. He had pulled up my integration deck, but the cover slide had been scrubbed clean of my name, in its place. His initials glared in bold font, like graffiti over a stolen painting. For a moment, the room froze. Marcy from finance lowered her gaze to her shoes. Diego from legal shifted, his hands tightening around his notepad. Even Camille, the quiet analyst I'd mentored last summer, opened her mouth as if to speak, but didn't. Nobody said a word. Silence weighed heavier than any insult. Trent let it hang there. I think he enjoyed it, mistaking humiliation for authority. I straightened, forcing my voice steady. "All right," I said. "I'll need the offboarding checklist." He blinked. The what IT retrieval, access logs, account decommissioning, third tab in the HR folder. The smirk faltered. For a second, he seemed like a boy who had stolen his father's suit and didn't know where the sleeves ended. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a pause. I slid my badge from its clip, placed it in his hand, and picked up my bag, the motivational mug I'd kept on my desk. Be the glue I left behind. I wasn't interested in glue anymore. I walked out past the glass, chin level, heart pounding but steady. By the time the elevator doors closed, I knew one thing: they could erase my name from a slide, but they hadn't erased the clause I'd written 6 months ago. That night, I sat in my Cambridge apartment, the skyline stretching outside my window like a neon promise I'd chased for years. When I first moved here, I used to stare at those towers and tell myself that one day I'd climb high enough to see the city from their top floors. 20 years later, all I had was a stack of performance reviews that never reached the C-suite and a resume littered with fires no one else could put out. I thought of the birthdays I'd missed Ivy's 8th, when I sent cupcakes by courier because I was still in a server room patching a system no one but me understood. The Thanksgiving. I spent alone with a frozen dinner and a migraine because our acquisition audit had to be reconciled before Europe's offices woke up. Nights blurred into mornings, my body propped up by vending machine coffee and the belief that loyalty meant security. The phone rang, cutting through the memories. Ivy's voice, soft but urgent. "Mom, is it true? They let you go." She was in Vermont, first year at college, her whole future balanced on scholarships and the quiet sacrifices I never told her about. I forced steadiness into my tone. "Yes, sweetheart. But don't worry, I'll make sure tuition is covered. You just focus on your classes." She hesitated. "What if you can't?" Her fear pierced me deeper than Trent's smug dismissal ever could. "I can," I said simply. "I always do." After she hung up, I sat in the dim kitchen, staring at the bills stacked neatly by the coffee maker. Every line item was a reminder of the years I'd poured into holding systems and lives together. They called me redundant, but I knew better. I wasn't an extra part. I was the thread, and somewhere, buried in the fine print of a contract they barely read, I had already woven myself into the foundation they thought they could stand on without me. 6 months before Trent staged my humiliation, I had been sitting in a conference room with fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than the people inside. The meeting was about indemnity schedules, a 3-hour slog no one wanted. The general counsel, Barbara, tapped her pen like she was hypnotizing herself, and the outside attorney, Elliot, A man who wore pocket squares as if they could disguise how dull he was droned on about continuity risk. He suggested role-based naming. "Keep it broad," he said. "Department heads, role titles. That way, if someone leaves, the clause still stands." He looked pleased with himself, like he'd solved corporate risk with a shrug. I was tired, migraine pushing glass shards behind my eyes, but I leaned forward anyway. That's too vague. If continuity is the concern, then ambiguity is the loophole. We should name a key person, one individual tied to indemnity. Barbara gave me that half-annoyed, half-curious look. And who would that be? I kept my tone casual, like I was reading from notes. The person who manages integration schemas, audit logs, vendor compliance, and ERP onboarding. Unless someone else has taken those over, that's me. The room fell into a silence that lasted longer than it should have. Elliot finally said, "That exposes you to point of failure risk." "We already are a point of failure risk," I countered, thinking of the batch scripts I'd written 4 years earlier after an Oracle consultant vanished mid-project. Better to acknowledge it than pretend otherwise. Barbara sighed, but she nodded. "Fine. File it under Section 14.4. Clause 9b. Elliot typed it out with the indifference of a man ordering lunch. No ceremony, no applause. Just a line of text buried in legal jargon. But as I watched the words settle onto the page, I felt something shift. It wasn't vanity. It was insurance. Not against being fired, though that seemed inevitable, but against being forgotten. I saved a copy in a private archive I called Ghost Protocol. And when I closed my laptop that afternoon, I knew I had just buried a live wire under the foundation of the company. The morning after I turned in my badge, I sat at my dining table with a lukewarm mug of coffee and filed the paperwork for my LLC, Marrow Integration Solutions, a name simple enough to sound trustworthy, but sharp enough to remind me that bones, not skin, hold things together. My laptop lived next to a basil plant, and the conference calls were replaced by silence. It felt strange, almost too quiet, but there was also relief in knowing that for the first time in years, I wasn't on call for anyone but myself. Meanwhile, Calvartech began to wobble. I still had friends inside, and their texts told a story faster than any quarterly report could. Vendor payments that used to clear without fuss now bounced back for missing documentation. The integration dashboards lit up in red alerts that no one knew how to decode. The fixes I'd once done instinctively weren't happening, and the whole machine groaned like a building with loose beams. Then came the email. A former colleague from a rival firm forwarded me a screenshot from a networking event. Trent had bragged, half drunk, that he'd finally cut the dead weight from his team. He called me by name, said I was just a process glue anyone could replace. The audience, mostly polite, had nodded along, but my contact typed beneath the screenshot, "He really doesn't know what you built, does he?" My first instinct was laughter, sharp and bitter. Dead weight. I thought of the audits I'd saved, the fire drills I'd extinguished, the deals I'd propped up when executives were too busy polishing their LinkedIn profiles. He was standing on a platform I'd built with my weekends and my migraines, and he thought removing me made him lighter. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't need to. The cracks were spreading on their own, and the higher Trent climbed on his rickety ladder, the harder the fall would be when the buyer finally looked down and saw the rot. It was close to midnight when I finally stopped working on a small client project and remembered the takeout bag sitting on the counter. The pad thai had gone cold, but I didn't care. I ate straight from the carton, laptop balanced on the edge of the table. When the new email alert chimed, the sender's name made me pause. Camille Ortega, a junior from finance, quiet and meticulous. The kind of analyst who saw details others skimmed over. Last summer, I had sat with her after hours, teaching her how to build a reconciliation macro. She had thanked me twice, once in person and once in a handwritten note slipped under my keyboard. Her email was short, almost hesitant. "Hey, weird question. I was reviewing the diligence binder and noticed your name is still listed under Clause 9b in Section 14.4. Was that just a placeholder we forgot to update? Or is it supposed to be active LMK? I read it 3 times. The words glowed against the dark screen like a fuse sparking to life. She thought it was a mistake, a clerical oversight. I knew better. That clause was no placeholder. It was a live charge wired directly into the heart of the $300 million deal. My hand hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, I almost typed a reply, something vague, something harmless. But then I stopped. I thought about Trent boasting I was dead weight. I thought about the skyline outside my window and the years I'd traded away for people who now pretended I had never existed. A smile pulled at my lips. Not a sweet smile. Not a bitter one, something sharper. I drafted a single sentence. It's active. Then, just as quickly, I hit delete. Silence, I reminded myself, can be louder than any reply. Let them wonder. Let them sweat. I closed the laptop, rinsed the empty carton, and left the kitchen light burning. Somewhere in the quiet dark, a countdown had started, and no one at Calvertech even knew the clock was running. A week later, I was sitting in a corner cafe in Somerville, the kind of place where the baristas know your name and the tables wobble no matter how many sugar packets you wedge underneath. My coffee steamed beside me, untouched, as I skimmed through a new client's integration plan. The hum of conversation and clatter of mugs was a kind of music I hadn't realized I'd missed. No fire drills, no executives snapping their fingers, just space to think. That's when the first message landed in my inbox. HR Generalist. Subject quick favor. It dripped with sugar. Hi, Celeste. Hope you're doing well. Could we hop on a short call to clarify some of the workflows you managed? Just trying to smooth the transition I didn't answer. By the afternoon, another came from operations, then procurement, then, oddly, Barbara herself. Each one circled the same desperate theme. No one could find the documentation, the governance maps, the escalation paths. They wanted me to swoop back in, quietly patch the holes, and disappear again. What they didn't know was that the buyer's legal team had already found what mattered most, buried in the diligence binder, highlighted in a polite orange markup, sat the line I had planted months ago. Key personnel Celeste Marrow. Continuity not provided. And leading that review was Marjorie Sellers, the buyer's senior counsel, a woman whose reputation stretched from Manhattan to Silicon Valley. She wasn't the type to miss a loose thread. She was the type to tug until the whole fabric came apart. I sipped my coffee and let the foam cling to the rim of the cup. Somewhere in Calvertech's glass tower, panic was blooming, and I could feel it reaching for me through every desperate email. But I stayed silent. Silence was leverage. Silence was pressure. I closed my laptop and stepped into the cool Boston air, the city lights flickering on. I knew Marjorie would ask the question soon, and when she did, the whole charade would unravel. The calendar invite called it Final Diligence Review, but everyone knew it was meant to be a victory lap. Calvertech's CEO logged in with his polished smile. Elias, the CFO, shuffled papers he probably hadn't read, and Barbara from legal looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Trent sat dead center, grinning into the camera as if the whole call were his stage. On the other side of the screen, in her Manhattan office, sat Marjorie Sellers. She didn't waste words, didn't bother with pleasantries. Her reputation had been enough to set the tone before she even spoke. The first half hour slid by in the usual choreography transition timelines, contingency plans, nods at synergies no one truly understood. Trent couldn't resist inserting himself, bragging about how he'd streamlined redundancies and eliminated unnecessary headcount to accelerate velocity. He said it like it was scripture. Then Marjorie moved. She adjusted her glasses, flipped a page in her binder, and cleared her throat. "There's one item I need clarity on before we proceed," she said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. Clause 9B continuity. Can someone confirm whether Celeste Marrow is still employed by Calvertech? The silence was brutal. Barbara's throat made a sound that might have been a gulp. The CEO's smile died mid-curve. Elias's pen froze. Trent blinked once, twice, as if his brain had lost signal. Marjorie waited only a beat before continuing, each word sharp as a blade. Because the schedule I have lists Ms. Marrow as the sole key person tied to indemnity acceptance. No continuity plan filed, no successor approved. The CEO turned, slow as a man watching his future collapse in real time. His voice was a whisper, lethal in its restraint. "Tell me you didn't." Trent opened his mouth, but nothing came. The smirk that had carried him this far drained from his face. Marjorie didn't flinch. "We are pausing the $300 million deal immediately. Further diligence is suspended pending compliance review." The line went dead quiet, the weight of her words pressing into every corner of that glass tower. The morning after the diligence call, my phone lit up like Times Square, missed calls stacked on top of each other. HR, procurement, even Barbara herself. The voicemails bled together. Just a quick check-in. "Would you mind clarifying a few legacy workflows? It'll only take 15 minutes. Promise by noon." They'd moved to LinkedIn. Connection requests from people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly arrived with cheery notes about staying in touch. One manager I barely remembered even added a smiley face, as though punctuation could erase the years of dismissal. I let them all sit unread. In the middle of that flood came a call I didn't expect. Elias Crane, the CFO. I hadn't heard his voice since my exit meeting, when he avoided eye contact and signed the forms like he was approving a furniture order. This time his tone was different, lower, more cautious. "Celeste," he began. "I told Trent this was a mistake. I told him you were the one piece we couldn't lose." His words tumbled out. Half confession, half plea. He wouldn't listen. Said the buyer wanted cuts, said you were replaceable. I argued. I really did. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the sound of a man realizing the ground beneath him was already gone. He was offering me something now regret. Maybe solidarity, but where was it when I needed it? I didn't speak. Didn't even breathe loud enough for him to know I was still on the line. After a long pause, he sighed. "If you decide to help, call me." Then the line clicked dead. I set the phone down beside my coffee. Their panic no longer belonged to me. They had cut the cord, and now the chandelier was swinging. I closed my laptop, the unanswered messages still blinking, and walked to the window. From my apartment, Boston's skyline gleamed, indifferent to the chaos in that glass tower across the river. The city was moving on, and so was I. 2 days later, the email arrived. It wasn't from Calvertech. It came directly from the buyer's legal team, stamped with the signature block of Marjorie Sellers herself. The subject line was crisp request for 1-hour consultation. Clause 9B. No emojis, no fake warmth, just professional gravity. They offered to compensate me for my time, generously. At 10 the next morning, I dialed in from my kitchen table, steam curling up from the mug in my hands. Birds outside my window chirped like they were oblivious to the fact that $300 million balanced on a single conversation. "Ms. Marrow," Marjorie said, her voice as precise as I remembered. "For the record, can you clarify the scope of Clause 9B? I didn't stall. Clause 9B names one individual, me, as the key person tied to indemnity. If my employment ends without a successor formally documented and approved, risk transfer halts. Indemnity coverage cannot be assumed, and it cannot be amended retroactively without my signature." Silence stretched across the line. I sipped my coffee. Someone whispered a curse under their breath. Marjorie asked the final question. "So, to resume indemnity, your signature is required." "Yes," I said, setting the mug down. "And I haven't signed." The next day, a revised term sheet landed on Calvertech's desk. The message was blunt. The deal will resume only if Celeste Marrow is reinstated for no less than 12 months, reporting directly to buyer oversight with full authority over integration. There was no negotiation, no wiggle room. By the afternoon, Trent was escorted out of the building with a cardboard box and a packet labeled Post-Employment Resources. His badge stopped working before he even reached the garage. I read the update from a friend inside, the words glowing on my phone screen as I leaned against my window. For the first time in months, I let myself exhale. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It looked like arrogance crumbling and silence finally speaking louder than the noise. 3 weeks later, I walked back through the revolving doors of Calvartech, not as a liaison tucked into the margins, but as Chief Integration Officer, installed by the very buyer who had once nearly signed without me. My badge opened every door, but I no longer needed to swipe it. A receptionist guided me directly to the top floor, where my new office overlooked the Boston skyline I used to study from across the river. The boardroom was waiting. The CEO sat rigid. Barbara from legal clutched her pen like a lifeline, and Elias tried to mask his unease with a polite smile. Trent's seat was empty. The leather chair pushed slightly askew as if even the furniture had disowned him. I carried the binder, the original insurance schedule, the continuity files, every redlined clause, and set it gently on the glass table. The sound was soft, but in that room it landed like a gavel. Each tab gleamed in its color-coded order, evidence of the foundation they had dismissed as excess. I let the silence stretch before I spoke. Clause 9B. I said evenly, "Let's make that plural." The words sank into the air, heavy and final. No one moved. No one dared. For years, they had minimized me as glue, as background, as replaceable. Now they understood what I had always known. I wasn't decoration. I was structure. Barbara's hand trembled. The CEO exhaled through his nose, eyes darting to the binder as though it might bite. Elias simply lowered his gaze, shame etched across his face. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Revenge had never been about tearing anything down. It was about proving that I had been the spine holding their empire upright. They tried to erase me, and instead, they erased themselves. As I looked out the window at the skyline glinting in the afternoon light, I thought about how silence had carried me here. Not protest, not shouting, just the steady weight of work no one else could claim. And in that silence, my name roared louder than every lie they had ever told.